That is your signature, Mrs. Mercer, isn't it? Judge Elaine Porter's voice was calm, almost gentle, but the question landed with more weight than anything shouted ever could. Rebecca sat across the courtroom from me in a tailored navy suit, one hand resting beside a yellow legal pad where she had spent the morning writing numbers and circling them twice. $12 million. Half the company, half the land beneath the factory, half the machines, the contracts, the name on the front gate. She had entered that courtroom believing those things were already hers. Then the judge slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wooden table, and for the first time since our divorce began, my wife stopped smiling. I watched her eyes move toward the bottom of the page. She did not need more than a second to recognize the handwriting. Rebecca always signed her name with a sharp upward stroke beneath the final letter, as if even her signature needed the last word. That same stroke sat there in black ink, 11 years old and perfectly preserved. Her attorney, Grant Holloway, leaned toward her and whispered something I could not hear. Rebecca did not answer him. Her fingers tightened around her pen until the plastic bent slightly. My attorney, Thomas Reed, remained still beside me. He had warned me not to react, not to look pleased, not to let the moment become personal. That was easy. I did not feel pleased. I felt tired. There is a difference between winning and finally being believed, and I had spent 3 weeks wondering whether the truth would survive the story Rebecca had built around it. According to her, Mercer Precision Fabrication was not a company I had created 6 years before we met. It was our business, our achievement, our fortune. She told the court she had sacrificed her career, her time, and the best years of her life so I could become successful. She said I had hidden ownership records, controlled the money, and used complicated paperwork to make her invisible. Grant repeated those accusations with the smooth confidence of a man who had billed hundreds of dollars an hour to make them sound reasonable. He described me as cold, calculating, and obsessed with keeping what should have been shared. I listened without interrupting. I kept both hands flat on the table. Anger would not change the paperwork. Neither would embarrassment. Across the aisle, Rebecca looked composed whenever Grant spoke, but I knew the small signs. The way she pressed her tongue against the inside of her cheek when she was impatient. The way she tapped her pen when she believed everyone else was moving too slowly. The way her shoulders lifted half an inch when someone questioned her version of events. I had known those movements for 11 years. Once, I had mistaken them for confidence. By the time we reached court, I understood they were warning lights. Judge Porter looked at Rebecca again. I asked whether this is your signature. The courtroom seemed to contract around the question. Even the air conditioning sounded louder. Rebecca finally lifted her eyes. It appears to be, she said. Not yes. Not no. It appears to be. That was how she spoke when the truth had become inconvenient. Judge Porter turned toward Grant. Was your client represented by independent counsel when this document was executed? Grant adjusted his glasses and glanced down at his notes. Your Honor, we have concerns regarding the circumstances surrounding the agreement. Thomas moved one finger against the folder in front of him, a signal for patience. The document had been witnessed by Rebecca's own attorney. It had been reviewed over 2 separate meetings. It had not been signed the night before our wedding or placed in front of her without explanation. She had asked questions. She had requested changes. She had initialed every page. None of that was visible yet to the people seated behind us, including 2 of my senior employees who had taken the morning off because they believed their jobs might be divided like furniture in an estate sale. They knew the company employed 43 people. They knew we had orders booked for the next 14 months. They knew a forced sale could destroy everything we had spent years building. What they did not know was why Rebecca's signature mattered. Neither did she, at least not completely. She remembered signing an agreement before our marriage. She believed it protected the company as it existed back then, when the factory was a rented warehouse with a leaking roof, 6 employees, and machines that broke down whenever the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. She believed the agreement protected the risk. She never imagined it might also protect the reward. Judge Porter turned the paper so the final paragraph faced Rebecca directly. Please read the sentence immediately above your signature. Rebecca looked down. Her lips parted, but no words came. I knew the sentence by memory. I had read it at 2 in the morning, sitting alone in Thomas's office while rain streaked the windows and the future of my company rested inside a manila folder. 11 years earlier, Rebecca had made a choice. She had wanted the marriage, not the debt. Now she wanted half the value created by the very risk she had refused to share. The judge waited. The courtroom waited. And as my wife stared at her own name, I realized the truth had finally reached the one place she could not talk her way around. 3 weeks earlier, the truth had looked much less certain. I was standing in Thomas Reed's office on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, watching sleet tap against the windows while he read the petition Rebecca's attorney had filed. The room smelled like coffee, paper, and radiator heat. Thomas read slowly, one page at a time, his expression giving me nothing. I sat across from him with my coat folded over my knees and grease still caught beneath one thumbnail from a machine inspection that morning. I had spent 17 years learning how to diagnose pressure before something failed. Bearings changed pitch. Motors ran hot. Steel pulled out of tolerance. A machine always warned you if you knew how to listen. Marriage was different. By the time I understood the sound Rebecca was making, the damage had already reached the foundation. Thomas placed the petition on his desk and looked at me over his reading glasses. She is claiming an equitable interest in 50% of Mercer Precision Fabrication. He said it without drama, which somehow made it worse. I stared at the page. Between us, she never owned a share. That is not the argument they are making. He tapped the document with one finger. They are saying the increase in value happened during the marriage, and that her contributions made that growth possible. Outside, a city bus moved through the gray street below, its tires spraying dirty water along the curb. I watched it pass while the words settled in. Rebecca was not asking for a check from our joint account or a portion of the house. She was reaching for the company itself, the machines, the contracts, the land. The name my father had helped me paint on a plywood sign when I opened the first shop. Can she do that? I asked. Thomas leaned back. She can ask. That answer felt like a loose bolt inside my chest. I had expected anger when the papers arrived. Instead, I felt a colder kind of pressure, the kind that builds silently behind a sealed valve. 43 people depended on that company. Some had worked beside me since the warehouse days. They had mortgages, children, medical bills, college tuition. Rebecca saw a number on a valuation report. I saw names on a payroll sheet. Thomas asked me to walk him through the history, so I started with the garage on West Broad Street. It was 800 square feet with a cracked concrete floor and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. I had one manual lathe, one drill press, and a pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on it. I slept in the office twice during the first winter because I could not afford both an apartment and the business lease. I was not proud of that. I was simply too stubborn to quit. 6 years later, I met Rebecca at a charity dinner hosted by one of our suppliers. By then, the company had 6 employees and enough debt to make success look like a rumor. She was smart, polished, and direct. She asked real questions about what I was building. Back then, that mattered more to me than anything. For the first few years, she did stand beside me. She brought food to the shop when I worked late. She helped organize the first employee Christmas dinner. When a major customer filed for bankruptcy and left us with nearly $180,000 in unpaid invoices, she sat with me at our kitchen table until midnight while I calculated how long we could survive. I did not erase those memories just because the marriage ended. That was what made her claim so difficult to hear. She had contributed to our life. She had encouraged me. She had shared years with me. But encouragement was not equity. Support was not a stock certificate. Marriage did not turn every sacrifice into ownership of every asset. Thomas listened without interrupting. Then he asked, did she ever work for the company formally? For a few years, part-time. Events, client dinners, some scheduling. Was she paid? Yes. Payroll. Taxes withheld. He nodded and wrote something down. Did she invest money? No. Sign any loan guarantees? No. Serve as an officer? No. Receive shares? Never. The questions came like measurements taken along a metal shaft, precise and unemotional. Each answer should have made me feel safer. It did not. Thomas closed his legal pad. Her attorney will argue that title is not the whole story. I looked at him. Then what is? Documentation. Timing. Source of funds. Corporate records. And the agreement you mentioned. I had told him about the document Rebecca and I signed before the wedding. At the time, I remembered it as a basic protection for the company, nothing more. Thomas asked me where the original was. I said it was probably in a file cabinet at the house or in storage with old tax records. He did not like the word probably. Daniel, this case is going to turn on details, not memories. We need the original, every amendment, every annual acknowledgement, every board record, and every tax filing. I nodded. For the first time, the room felt smaller. Rebecca had already started telling people that I was hiding assets. She told mutual friends I had built the company on her unpaid labor. She told her sister I had controlled every dollar in our marriage. By the time the petition reached court, she had constructed a version of our life where she was the unseen partner and I was the man trying to erase her. Stories move faster than records. That was the problem. Thomas slid the petition back toward me. On the final page, Rebecca had signed beneath a statement declaring that her claims were true to the best of her knowledge. I stared at her name. The same sharp upward stroke. The same certainty. At that moment, I did not know another signature was waiting in an older file, one she had forgotten, and I had almost forgotten too. I only knew that if I could not prove the difference between sharing a marriage and owning a company, everything I had built could be measured, divided, and sold before the truth ever reached the room. I left Thomas Reed's office with a list of records long enough to make 17 years of work feel like a crime scene. The sleet had turned to wet snow by the time I reached the parking garage, and the wind pushed it sideways beneath the concrete levels. I sat behind the wheel of my truck without starting the engine, watching white flakes melt against the windshield. Somewhere between the courthouse petition and Thomas's questions, my company had stopped feeling like a place where people built things and started feeling like a stack of evidence. To understand why that frightened me, you have to understand what Mercer Precision Fabrication looked like before anyone believed it had value. The first shop was not impressive. It sat behind an auto parts warehouse on the west side of Columbus, squeezed between a tire distributor and a fenced lot full of rusted delivery vans. The sign above my door was plywood painted white, with the company name in blue letters my father and I measured by hand. The building had no front office, no polished lobby, and no conference room. Customers entered through the same door we used to move steel stock. In winter, the concrete floor stayed cold enough to make my boots feel hollow. In summer, the air inside carried the smell of cutting fluid, hot metal, and dust. I had saved $42,000 before opening the doors. It sounded like a fortune until I priced equipment. The used manual lathe cost $18,000. The drill press took another $4,000. Insurance, rent, tooling, utilities, and materials swallowed the rest before the first invoice was paid. My father loaned me $12,000 from money he had set aside after retiring from the Postal Service. He did not call it an investment. He called it faith with a repayment schedule. I signed a note at his kitchen table and paid every dollar back with interest. My first customer ordered 20 steel bushings for a farm equipment repair company outside Dayton. The total invoice was $680. I checked every measurement 3 times because one bad part could have ended the relationship before it started. I delivered the order myself in the same pickup truck I still owned when I met Rebecca. The tailgate would not stay closed unless I secured it with a length of chain. The heater worked on the passenger side, but not the driver's side. It was not a symbol of failure. It was transportation, storage, and sometimes an office. For the first 2 years, I worked alone more often than not. I answered calls while machines were running. I wrote invoices at midnight. I swept the floor because there was no one else to do it. When orders slowed, I repaired small parts for local contractors. When orders increased, I slept on a folding cot behind the storage racks so I could start early without spending money on gasoline. People like to describe success as a straight line after the danger has passed. It was never straight. It was a series of narrow decisions with no guarantee that the next one would hold. Marcus Bell joined me during the 3rd year. He had worked maintenance at a packaging plant and understood machinery better than most people understood conversation. He did not ask for promises. He asked whether I could make payroll on Friday. I told him yes, even though that week I paid him before I paid myself. Marcus became the first person besides my father who treated the business like it might survive. We won a contract making precision brackets for an agricultural equipment manufacturer. The order was larger than anything we had handled. To complete it, I borrowed $90,000 for a computer-controlled milling machine and signed a personal guarantee that put everything I owned behind the loan. There was no shared home to protect then. No spouse absorbing the risk. No family account covering the payment. Just my signature, my credit, and a machine that had to run enough hours every month to justify its place on the floor. By the 6th year, we had 6 employees, 3 major customers, and annual sales just over $1 million. That number sounded impressive until you understood how much of it belonged to payroll, material, rent, insurance, maintenance, and debt. On paper, I owned a growing company. In reality, I owned responsibility. That was the version of Mercer Precision Fabrication that existed when Rebecca entered my life. Not the modern plant with 43 employees and loading docks along the south wall. Not the $12 million valuation her attorney would later place on a courtroom exhibit. She met me when the roof leaked above the inspection table and a missed payment from one customer could delay every plan I had made. I never hid that from her. On our 3rd date, I took her to the shop because an overnight order had to be checked before shipment. She walked through the building in a wool coat, careful not to step in the coolant near the milling machine. She asked why I kept working if the risk was so high. I told her the same thing I had told myself every morning. Because one day this place will provide a future for more people than me. She smiled then. She said ambition looked good on me. I believed she understood what she was seeing. Years later, her attorney would describe those early days as the beginning of our shared enterprise. But Rebecca had not been there when I signed the leases, guaranteed the loans, or wondered whether the account balance would cover Friday payroll. She came after the foundation had been poured, while the concrete was still rough, but already carrying weight. That distinction mattered. Thomas had warned me that memory would not be enough. So I drove from the parking garage to the original shop, which we still used for storage, and unlocked the side door with a key I had carried for 17 years. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight. Old file cabinets stood against the back wall beneath the faded plywood sign. Somewhere inside those drawers were the records of the man I had been before Rebecca knew my name. Somewhere inside them, I hoped, was proof that the company had a history she could not rewrite. The flashlight beam moved across the old file cabinets, catching dust on the handles and labels written in my own handwriting. Payroll, equipment, loans, insurance. The history of Mercer Precision Fabrication had been reduced to metal drawers that stuck when I pulled them. I set my coat on a workbench, rolled up my sleeves, and started with the oldest files. The first folder held canceled checks, handwritten invoices, and copies of purchase orders faded at the edges. The second contained bank statements from years when keeping $5,000 in the account felt like a victory. Every page carried a version of my life that existed before Rebecca, but as I searched, I found myself remembering the years after she arrived too. That was the part her legal claim made difficult. It would have been easier if she had always been selfish. She had not. In the beginning, Rebecca brought warmth into places that had known only fluorescent light and machine noise. She worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company, and her schedule was demanding, but she still came to the shop some evenings with takeout containers balanced in both hands. She would sit on an overturned shipping crate while Marcus and I finished a production run, asking questions about customers and laughing when I tried to explain tolerances over cold sandwiches. She never pretended to understand the machines. What she understood was me. At least I believed she did. When one of our largest customers filed for bankruptcy, the unpaid invoices totaled nearly $180,000. I remember spreading the numbers across our kitchen table before we were married. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the rain against the windows. I had payroll due in 9 days, loan payments due in 12, and enough cash to cover only one of them. Rebecca sat across from me in an old college sweatshirt, reading every line without interrupting. "What happens if you lose the company?" she asked. "I lose the equipment, my savings, and probably my credit for years. What happens to the employees? They lose their jobs." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Then we figure out how to keep it alive." I carried that sentence with me for years. We did keep it alive. I negotiated payment plans, delayed my own salary, sold a spare truck, and convinced 2 suppliers to extend our terms. Rebecca helped organize a dinner for several local business owners and introduced me to a purchasing manager who eventually became a customer. She did not invest money. She did not sign the loans. But she opened a door, and I never denied it. After we married, she helped with the annual employee Christmas dinner and a few client events. When the company grew large enough to need formal marketing support, I offered to hire an agency. Rebecca said she could handle some of it part-time. We put her on payroll. She received regular checks, tax forms, and a written job description. She chose her own hours and worked mostly from home. At first, the arrangement felt natural. She prepared invitations, reviewed brochures, and corrected my habit of writing emails like equipment manuals. She was good at presenting the company in a polished way. I was good at making sure the company had something real to present. We had different roles, and for a while, they fit together. That truth mattered to me. I did not want Thomas to win by pretending Rebecca had done nothing. I wanted the records to show exactly what she had done, no more and no less. The problem was that memories expand when money gives them room. A few client dinners became years of unpaid executive leadership. Part-time marketing became co-founding the company. Encouragement became ownership. By the time she filed the petition, Rebecca no longer described herself as my wife who had supported a difficult career. She described herself as the invisible partner behind every contract we had ever signed. I opened another drawer and found a box from our wedding year. Inside were receipts, tax documents, and a folder marked corporate planning. My pulse changed. I carried it to the workbench and opened it beneath the hanging shop light. The first pages were familiar. Financial projections, loan summaries, an equipment schedule. Then I found a letter from an attorney named Susan Caldwell, the lawyer Rebecca had chosen before our wedding. The letter confirmed that Susan represented Rebecca independently in discussions concerning my company. I read the date twice. 11 years earlier. Attached to it was a memo summarizing a proposal I had almost forgotten. Before we married, I had offered Rebecca the opportunity to purchase 5% of Mercer Precision Fabrication for a modest price based on the company's value at the time. It was not a gift. Ownership came with risk. She would have needed to contribute capital and accept responsibility for part of the equipment debt. I remembered the conversation at our kitchen table. Rebecca had listened, looked at the loan schedule, and shaken her head. "I want to marry you, Daniel," she had said. "I do not want to marry your debt." I had respected that decision. In some ways, I had been relieved. The company was unstable, and I did not want business pressure poisoning our marriage. I told her the door could remain open if we documented a future purchase properly. But no purchase ever happened. I searched deeper into the folder. There were draft agreements, attorney notes, and correspondence with our accountant. The final signed document was not there. Still, the paper in my hands changed the shape of the room. Rebecca had not been excluded from ownership. She had been offered a path to it and declined. She wanted the marriage without the business risk. Years later, when the risk had become value, she would tell a court the company had always belonged to both of us. I copied every page with my phone and placed the originals inside a clean envelope. Then I noticed a handwritten note clipped behind the attorney's letter. For words stood beneath Rebecca's initials. Separate property, terms accepted. It was not the signature Thomas needed, but it pointed toward the document that contained it. The note beneath Rebecca's initials gave me direction, but not certainty. I photographed it, locked the original folder inside my truck, and called Thomas from the parking lot outside the old shop. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Snow had covered the loading area in a thin white sheet, softening the edges of everything I had built. Thomas answered on the fourth ring. I told him about Susan Caldwell's letter, the 5% offer, and the note confirming that Rebecca had accepted the separate property terms. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked the only question that mattered. "Do you have the executed agreement?" I looked through the windshield at the faded plywood sign resting behind the shop window. "Not yet." "Then you have a trail, Daniel. Not proof." The words were not cruel. Thomas did not waste comfort where precision was needed. He told me to bring every document to his office the next morning. He would contact Susan Caldwell and request her archived file, assuming she still had it. 11 years was a long time in a law office. Files moved. Firms merged. Storage policies changed. A document could exist in memory and still disappear from the world. I spent the rest of that night searching. The old shop held tax records, loan statements, and corporate minutes, but not the signed agreement. At midnight, I drove to the house Rebecca and I had once shared. She had already moved into a furnished condominium near Easton, leaving behind the furniture she did not want and the silence she had created. The kitchen lights came on automatically when I opened the door. For a moment, the room looked exactly as it had during our better years. The same oak table, the same clock above the pantry, the same shallow scratch in the floor from the Christmas tree stand we dragged across it one December. A life can end while its objects remain perfectly arranged. I went to the basement and opened the storage closet beneath the stairs. Boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling, labeled by year in Rebecca's careful handwriting. Holiday decorations, insurance, home repairs, wedding. I pulled the wedding box into the center of the room and opened it. Inside were invitation samples, receipts from the hotel, photographs, and a dried ribbon from Rebecca's bouquet. Beneath them sat a white envelope from Susan Caldwell's former firm. My hand stopped. The envelope held a copy of the engagement letter, billing statements, and Rebecca's handwritten notes from her legal meetings. She had underlined several phrases. Separate asset. Independent counsel. No automatic equity. One note was written in the margin beside a list of company debts. Too much liability. Daniel keeps business. I read those words 3 times. They were not proof by themselves, but they showed that Rebecca understood the choice in front of her. She had not been pressured. She had not been excluded. She had studied the risk and decided it belonged to me. Near the bottom of the box, I found a small flash drive taped to an old tax envelope. I plugged it into the computer in my home office. The drive contained scanned household records from the year we married. Most were ordinary. Insurance policies, closing documents, copies of identification. Then a file appeared with a name so plain I nearly skipped it. Final agreement. I opened it. 22 pages filled the screen. The first page identified Mercer Precision Fabrication as property I had created and owned before the marriage. The next pages listed equipment, loans, customer contracts, and outstanding obligations. Rebecca's initials appeared at the bottom of each page. On page 19, the language became more specific. It stated that marriage alone would not grant her shares, voting rights, management authority, or any claim of ownership. Any future transfer of equity required a separate written instrument signed by both of us and entered into the corporate records. No such instrument had ever been created. Page 21 addressed the 5% offer. It confirmed that Rebecca had received financial disclosures, consulted her own attorney, and declined the opportunity to purchase an interest because she did not wish to assume business debt or personal liability. Then I reached the final page. Her signature sat beneath a paragraph acknowledging that the company, its ownership, and its growth derived from retained business earnings would remain separate unless we later agreed otherwise in writing. Susan Caldwell's signature appeared beside hers. A notary seal rested below both. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the weight of every year between that signature and the courtroom petition. Rebecca had known exactly where the line was drawn. Success had not blurred it. Money had simply made her want to move it. I saved copies to 3 separate drives and emailed the file to Thomas before calling him. He answered with the same steady voice. I told him what I had found. There was a pause, then the sound of paper shifting on his desk. Send me the entire drive, not just the agreement. Why? Because they will argue the document is outdated, incomplete, or overcome by what happened later. We need to prove the line was never changed. The relief disappeared as quickly as it came. One signature mattered, but Thomas was right. Rebecca's attorney would not surrender because an old document had surfaced. He would search for joint funds, implied ownership, or conduct that contradicted the agreement. The paper was not the end of the fight. It was the first solid piece of ground beneath my feet. Before hanging up, Thomas asked whether Rebecca had ever signed anything after the wedding that referred to her status with the company. I thought about payroll forms, tax returns, benefit documents, and the annual conflict disclosures our accountant required. Somewhere in those records, Rebecca may have repeated the truth year after year. I looked at the glowing signature on the computer screen and understood what we had to find next. Not one moment of clarity, but a pattern she could not explain away. The pattern began in the accounting office, not the courtroom. By 8 the next morning, I was standing beside our chief financial officer, Linda Carver, while she unlocked a cabinet that held 11 years of payroll records, tax documents, shareholder reports, and annual disclosures. Linda had worked for Mercer Precision Fabrication since the company moved out of the original warehouse. She was careful with numbers and even more careful with language. When I told her what Thomas needed, she removed her glasses and studied me for a moment. You are asking whether Rebecca ever represented herself as an owner in company records. I'm asking what the records say, even if I do not like the answer. Linda nodded once. That was the only promise she needed. We started with payroll. Rebecca had been classified as a part-time employee during the years she handled events and marketing support. Her checks listed wages, withholding, and benefits exactly like everyone else's. She had signed employment agreements identifying Daniel Mercer as the sole shareholder and Marcus Bell as operations director. She had completed tax forms as an employee, not a partner. She had accepted raises, submitted expense reports, and requested schedule changes through the same system used by the rest of the staff. None of that meant she had contributed nothing. It meant the contribution had been defined, compensated, and recorded. By noon, the conference table was covered with folders. Each year added another layer. Annual insurance questionnaires asked whether any employee held an ownership interest. Rebecca had checked no. Conflict of interest forms asked whether she had authority to bind the company to contracts. She had checked no. Benefit enrollment documents listed her relationship to the company as employee and spouse of owner. Her initials appeared beside each description. The language was not dramatic. That was what made it powerful. Truth rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it sits quietly in ordinary boxes, waiting for someone to remember where it was filed. Linda found a set of board meeting acknowledgments from the years when Rebecca helped coordinate client events. At the bottom of each one, she had signed a statement confirming that attendance did not grant management authority or equity. I had forgotten those forms existed. Our accountant had insisted on them after Rebecca began sitting in on a few planning meetings. At the time, she had laughed about the paperwork. "You people document everything," she had said. Marcus answered, "That is how businesses stay businesses." The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Rebecca had rolled her eyes, signed the page, and moved on. Back then, no one imagined the sentence would matter. Success changed the meaning of old words. It also changed Rebecca's relationship with the company. The first real shift came after we landed a national contract to produce precision components for agricultural equipment. The agreement doubled our annual revenue within 18 months. We purchased a new facility on the south side of Columbus, added 2 automated machining centers, and expanded to 30 employees. Rebecca walked through the new building before the floors had been finished. She stood beneath the high ceiling, looked toward the loading docks, and said, "We finally made it." I remember smiling. I thought she meant the two of us had survived difficult years. Later, I realized she meant something else. At social events, she began introducing herself as co-owner. The first time I heard it, I corrected her gently in the car. She stared out the passenger window and said I was embarrassing her over a technicality. I told her it was not a technicality. Ownership affected loans, taxes, liability, and legal authority. She said, "Everyone knows I helped build it." "You did help me," I answered. "That is not the same as owning shares." The silence that followed felt heavier than the disagreement. From then on, she used our business whenever she spoke about success, but your company whenever something went wrong. When equipment repairs cost $90,000, it was my problem. When a valuation estimated the business at $8 million, it became our future. 2 years later, an investment group from Chicago offered to purchase a controlling interest. The number on the first letter was large enough to make Rebecca stop in the middle of the kitchen. She read it twice and placed it flat on the counter like it was already money in our account. "You have to take this," she said. I told her the offer would cost us control, likely close one production line, and put at least 12 jobs at risk. She said I was being sentimental. I said I was being responsible. That argument lasted for weeks. She wanted a vacation home in Florida, a larger house, and the kind of freedom she believed the sale would buy. I wanted to keep the company independent and protect the people who had carried it through the unstable years. When I rejected the offer, something in our marriage hardened. Rebecca stopped asking how the company was doing and started asking what it was worth. She wanted quarterly numbers, equipment values, cash reserves, and debt schedules. The questions sounded informed, but they did not sound interested. They sounded prepared. Linda noticed it too. She reminded me of an email Rebecca had sent asking for the current shareholder ledger. Linda had replied that the ledger listed one shareholder, Daniel Mercer, and asked whether Rebecca needed anything else. Rebecca never answered. We found that email in the archive and printed it. The date was 18 months before the divorce petition. Thomas called while the printer was still running. I told him about the payroll forms, acknowledgments, insurance questionnaires, and the shareholder email. He was quiet for several seconds. "Good," he said. Now we know she did not merely sign once. She confirmed the same fact repeatedly. I looked across the table at the rows of documents bearing Rebecca's name. Will that be enough? It will be harder to explain away. Harder was not the same as impossible. Thomas warned me that Grant would shift the argument. If Rebecca could not prove legal ownership, he would claim that marital money had created the company's increase in value. He would say joint resources funded equipment, buildings, and growth. That meant every major purchase had to be traced. Every loan had to be matched to its source. Every dollar had to tell the same story as the signatures. I stood in the accounting office as the afternoon light faded against the windows. On the table, 11 years of records formed a line Rebecca had crossed only after the company became valuable enough to desire. She had once called the business debt. Then she called it ours. Now she was asking a court to make that word true. Grant Holloway shifted the argument exactly where Thomas said he would. 2 days after we finished reviewing the company records, his office sent a new filing claiming that even if Rebecca had never held legal ownership, the growth of Mercer Precision Fabrication had been fueled by marital resources. The language was polished. The implication was simple. My company may have existed before the marriage, but its success belonged to both of us. Thomas read the filing in silence while I sat across from him in the same downtown office, the same radiator clicking beneath the window, the same gray winter pressing against the glass. When he finished, he placed the pages beside the original agreement and folded his hands. This is the stronger version of their case, he said. They are no longer pretending she had shares. They are arguing that the increase in value came from money and effort that belonged to the marriage. I looked at the stack of records on his desk. We already showed she was paid for the work she did. That helps with effort. Now we trace the money. The sentence sounded simple. It was not. 17 years of business growth had moved through hundreds of accounts, loans, equipment purchases, tax returns, and retained earnings. Every expansion had a source. Every machine had a payment history. Every building improvement had an invoice. Grant did not need to prove Rebecca owned the company. He only needed to create enough uncertainty around how the company grew. Uncertainty is expensive in a courtroom. It turns facts into arguments and records into interpretations. Thomas brought in a forensic accountant named Evelyn Price, a woman in her early 50s with silver-framed glasses and the patience of someone who trusted numbers more than people. She arrived at the factory carrying 2 hard cases and a legal pad divided into narrow columns. Her first question was not about Rebecca. It was about the company bank accounts. How many operating accounts have existed since the marriage began? I told her 3. 1 primary account, 1 payroll account, and 1 equipment reserve account. Any personal funds deposited into them? Not after the company became stable. Any joint marital funds? Not that I remember. She looked at me over her glasses. Memory is not useful to me. I understood immediately why Thomas hired her. Evelyn did not accuse. She measured. Over the next week, she and Linda traced every major purchase made during the marriage. The second automated machining center had been financed through a commercial loan secured by company assets and repaid from operating revenue. The South Columbus building had been purchased through a corporate mortgage, with the down payment drawn from retained earnings. The expansion of the loading docks, the inspection lab, and the climate control system all came from business accounts. No joint savings account funded them. No home equity loan supported them. No check bearing both our names entered the company ledger. The company had grown from money the company earned. That distinction should have brought relief. Instead, Evelyn found one item that stopped the room cold. 7 years earlier, Rebecca and I had received a tax refund of $26,000. The refund had been deposited into our joint account. 3 days later, I transferred $20,000 into Mercer Precision Fabrication during a cash flow shortage. I remembered the week. A customer had delayed payment, payroll was due, and a supplier would not release material without a deposit. I had moved the money without thinking of it as an investment. 6 weeks later, the company repaid the joint account in full, with interest. But the initial transfer existed. Grant would use it. Thomas leaned over the bank statement and tapped the date. This is their opening. It was a short-term loan, I said. Was it documented as one? I looked at Linda. She searched the accounting system and found a ledger entry marked temporary shareholder advance. The wording was a problem. Shareholder. Singular. Me. But the funds came from a joint account. Evelyn asked whether Rebecca had signed any promissory note or loan acknowledgement. No one answered. We found repayment records, interest calculations, and an email I had sent Rebecca explaining that the company would return the money within 60 days. Her response contained only 3 words. Fine. Handle it. Thomas read the email twice. This helps, but Grant will say marital funds preserve the company at a critical moment. The old pressure returned, quiet and mechanical. One transfer made years earlier could be stretched into a claim against millions in later growth. Rebecca had not signed the equipment loans. She had not accepted the business risk. Yet one temporary bridge from a joint account gave her attorney something solid enough to stand on. Evelyn did not look worried. She asked for the company valuation from the month before the transfer and the month after repayment. She wanted to know whether the money purchased an asset, increased equity, or simply passed through working capital. 3 days later, she returned with a chart. The $20,000 had not purchased equipment or shares. It had covered payroll and material for an order that was completed and paid. The company repaid the money with 6% annualized interest. The joint account earned more from the transaction than it would have earned in savings. This was a loan, Evelyn said. Temporary, traceable, and satisfied. It did not create ownership. Thomas nodded, but he did not smile. Grant will still argue it shows marital contribution. Evelyn closed the file. Then he will have to explain why repayment ended the contribution. For the first time that week, the room felt level again. Then Thomas received another document from Grant's office. It was an affidavit signed by Rebecca. In it, she claimed that I had repeatedly promised her half the company in private conversations and that the written agreement had been replaced by our conduct during the marriage. I read the statement slowly. She described dinners, planning sessions, and years of emotional support. She described herself as a partner in everything except title. At the bottom sat her familiar signature, sharp and confident. Thomas placed the affidavit beside the older records. Now we have the real question, he said. Can she convince the judge that your life together changed what she signed? I looked at the 2 signatures separated by 11 years. One accepted the company as mine. The other claimed it had become hers. Only one of them could describe the truth. Evelyn Price answered Thomas's question the way she answered everything else, with records. She asked Linda to pull every annual disclosure Rebecca had signed from the first year of our marriage through the year she stopped working for the company. Then she requested payroll files, tax forms, insurance questionnaires, board attendance acknowledgments, and every email in which Rebecca discussed her role. For 2 days, the accounting office became a quiet archive of our marriage. Boxes lined the wall. Printed messages covered the conference table. Dates formed a timeline neither anger nor memory could bend. The first document was signed 8 months after our wedding. It identified Rebecca as a part-time marketing employee and listed her ownership interest as none. Her initials appeared beside the line. The next year, the same answer appeared again. No equity interest held. The year after that, the form changed, but the question did not. Did the employee own, control, or possess rights to any shares of Mercer Precision Fabrication? Rebecca checked no and signed beneath it. One signature could be called forgotten. 2 could be called routine. 11 years of consistent answers became something else. They became a pattern. Evelyn arranged the documents in chronological order and slid them toward Thomas. Her affidavit says the written agreement was replaced by conduct during the marriage, she said. The conduct says the opposite. Thomas studied each page without speaking. I stood near the window, watching delivery trucks move through the factory yard below. The machines on the production floor ran with their usual rhythm, steady and indifferent. 43 people were working beneath us, unaware that their future had been reduced to a question about what Rebecca meant when she signed her name. Linda opened an archived email from 6 years earlier. Rebecca had asked whether she could approve a new marketing contract while I was traveling. Linda replied that only an officer or authorized manager could bind the company. Rebecca answered, "Understood. Daniel will sign when he returns." Another email appeared from 3 years later, after the investment group made its offer. Rebecca had requested the current shareholder list. Linda sent a single-page ledger showing one name, Daniel Mercer. Rebecca replied, "Thank you. No objection. No correction. No claim that a promised half had been omitted." Thomas leaned back and exhaled. Slowly. "This is useful," he said. but Grant will say she trusted Daniel to formalize the ownership later. Evelyn opened another folder. Then he has a problem. Inside was a compensation review Rebecca had signed 4 years before the divorce. The form listed her salary, duties, and status. Beneath the compensation section was a paragraph explaining that wages, bonuses, and benefits did not constitute equity or create any claim to ownership. Rebecca had requested a raise that year. She negotiated the amount. She signed the revised agreement. Her signature sat directly below the ownership disclaimer. Thomas read it once, then again. Why was this language included? Linda answered before I could. Because she had started introducing herself as co-owner at client events. Our insurance carrier required clarification. I remembered the conversation that followed. Rebecca had been furious that the company corrected her title. She accused me of humiliating her over a technical distinction. I told her the distinction was legal, financial, and necessary. She signed anyway. The moment had faded into the noise of our marriage, but the paper had not forgotten. Evelyn continued tracing the company's growth. Every major asset had been purchased with retained earnings or commercial financing. The building mortgage was in the company's name. The automated machining centers were secured by business property. The expansion loan carried my personal guarantee, not Rebecca's. The temporary $20,000 transfer from our joint account had been repaid within 6 weeks with interest. No marital funds remained invested. No shares had been issued. No ownership document had ever been amended. The line drawn before our wedding had never moved. Grant's theory depended on conduct replacing the written agreement. The records showed the written agreement had been confirmed again and again. Still, Thomas did not allow relief to enter the room. We have to assume she will testify that she did not understand what she signed. I looked at the files spread across the table. She had her own attorney. Yes. She negotiated changes. Yes. She signed every year. Yes. Then how can she say she did not understand? Thomas closed the folder. Because people say many things when the alternative is admitting they changed their mind after the money arrived. His words carried no judgment, only experience. That afternoon, Susan Caldwell returned his call. She had retired from full-time practice, but still maintained archived client files in secured storage. She remembered Rebecca. More importantly, she remembered the agreement. Susan said Rebecca had been careful, informed, and focused on limiting her exposure to business debt. She had asked whether marriage could make her responsible for equipment loans. She had asked whether creditors could reach joint property. She had rejected the 5% purchase after reviewing the liabilities. Susan's notes recorded Rebecca's reasoning in plain language. I want the marriage, not the business risk. Thomas asked whether Susan would testify. She said yes. Then she told him she had the original signed agreement, not merely a scanned copy. The paper had been stored with her closing file for 11 years. When Thomas repeated those words, the room changed. Not loudly. Nothing dramatic happened. Linda sat down. Evelyn removed her glasses. I placed both hands on the conference table and felt the solid wood beneath them. For weeks, Rebecca's story had moved faster than the truth. Now the truth had witnesses, dates, ledgers, and an original signature. Thomas looked at me and said, "This does not mean the case is over." I nodded. I had learned not to confuse solid ground with the finish line. But for the first time, Rebecca's affidavit no longer looked dangerous. It looked lonely. One new claim stood against 11 years of her own records. She had signed the truth when the company was dead. She had signed it again as the company grew. She had signed it when the valuation reached $8 million. And now, only after $12 million appeared on a report, she wanted the court to believe every earlier signature meant nothing. Rebecca's attorney changed his tone when the hearing began. Grant Holloway no longer described her as a hidden owner. He described her as a devoted wife whose work had been absorbed into a company that carried only my name. It was a better story, cleaner, more human. He spoke about the years Rebecca brought dinner to the shop, organized client events, and sat beside me during difficult financial decisions. He said success had been built inside a marriage, not in isolation. Then he asked the court to recognize what the corporate records had failed to recognize. I listened without looking at Rebecca. Some of what he said was true. That was what made it effective. Rebecca had supported me. She had stood beside me during hard years. She had offered ideas, made introductions, and helped turn formal dinners into business relationships. I had never denied those things. But Grant arranged them carefully, placing each memory beside the next until support began to resemble ownership. Judge Elaine Porter listened with her hands folded on the bench. She did not interrupt. When Grant finished, he called Rebecca to testify. She walked to the witness chair in a dark blue suit and answered the first questions calmly. She described our early marriage, the long evenings, and the uncertainty surrounding the company. Her voice softened when she spoke about the kitchen table where we once reviewed unpaid invoices. She said she believed we were building something together. I remembered that night too. Rain against the windows. Numbers spread across the table, her hand covering mine. Then Grant asked when she first understood that I did not intend to treat the company as a shared asset. Rebecca looked toward me for the first time. When Daniel started making decisions without me, she said. When the company became successful, he stopped calling it ours. The words settled through the courtroom. I wanted to correct her. I wanted to say that the company had always been legally mine and that I had never hidden it. Thomas touched the edge of his legal pad, reminding me that truth did not need to rush. Grant showed Rebecca photographs from employee dinners, trade events, and the opening of the South Columbus facility. In every picture, she stood beside me, smiling, present. He asked whether she had been paid for every hour she spent helping the company. She said no. He asked whether I had ever promised that the business would provide for both of us. She said yes. He asked whether she believed that meant she had a stake in its future. She paused just long enough to make the answer sound painful. I did. That was the center of her case. Not a stock certificate. A belief. Thomas waited until Grant returned to his table. Then he approached the witness chair carrying a thin folder. His voice remained respectful. Mrs. Mercer, you were represented by your own attorney before the marriage, correct? Yes. Susan Caldwell? Yes. She reviewed the financial condition of Mercer Precision Fabrication with you? Generally. Thomas opened the folder. Did she show you the company's loan obligations? Rebecca shifted slightly. I do not remember every document. Do you remember declining the opportunity to purchase 5% of the company? Grant stood. Objection. The characterization is incomplete. Judge Porter looked at Thomas. Lay the foundation. Thomas nodded and handed Rebecca a copy of Susan's letter. Do you recognize this correspondence? Rebecca studied the first page. It appears familiar. Your initials are on the second page? Yes. The letter confirms you were offered an ownership interest and declined it after reviewing the debt, correct? Rebecca's eyes moved toward Grant. I was not comfortable taking on that kind of liability. Thomas let the answer remain in the air. Then he placed one of the annual disclosures on the document screen. Rebecca's signature appeared large enough for everyone to see. 4 years after the marriage, you identified yourself as an employee with no equity interest. Is that your signature? Yes. Another form appeared. The following year? Yes. Another. And the year after that? Yes. Each answer shortened. Each page tightened the space around her story. Thomas did not accuse her of lying. He simply continued measuring. He showed the compensation agreement, the insurance questionnaire, the board attendance acknowledgement, and the email requesting the shareholder ledger. Rebecca admitted receiving each one. She agreed that the ledger listed only my name. She admitted she had not objected at the time. Grant tried to repair the damage on redirect. He asked whether legal forms always reflected the emotional reality of a marriage. Rebecca said no. He asked whether she trusted me to make ownership formal later. She said yes. For a moment, the case tilted back toward uncertainty. A promise spoken in private leaves no mark except memory. Then Thomas called Susan Caldwell. She entered the courtroom carrying the original closing file. Susan testified that Rebecca had understood the agreement, negotiated its terms, and specifically rejected ownership because she did not want business liability. She explained that no future transfer could occur without a separate written instrument. Thomas asked whether any such instrument existed in her file. No, Susan said. Did Mrs. Mercer ever ask you to prepare one? No. Did she appear confused about the distinction between marriage and ownership? Susan looked toward Rebecca before answering. No. She was very clear. The courtroom became still. Grant had built his case from feelings that changed over time. Susan brought records from the moment before money changed anything. Thomas returned to our table and placed the original agreement beside Rebecca's affidavit. 11 years separated the signatures. One had been made after independent advice, before success, before resentment, before a $12 million valuation. The other had been made after the marriage ended. Judge Porter studied both documents. Then she asked for the original agreement to be marked as evidence. I watched the clerk carry it forward. The paper looked ordinary beneath the courtroom lights. 22 pages. Black ink. A notary seal. Nothing about it looked powerful. Yet every important structure begins with lines most people overlook. Measurements. Terms. Signatures. Rebecca had once accepted those lines because they protected her from risk. Now they stood between her and the reward she believed time had given her.